Hi, folks. This is the Rocky Mountain Short Takes on Suicide Prevention podcast. I was the one who found this guest, and I found Chryss Cada through an article she was writing for the Denver Post that actually was announcing that she'd no longer be writing for the Post and was going to take time out to work on a book about her brother's suicide. So I reached out to her because, one, she was a very engaging writer, and two, I wanted to hear the story that she had to tell. So, Chryss, thank you very much for taking the time today to join us on this podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Chryss, your story is about your brother's suicide. He was 15 and you were 12.
Correct.
And now that's 4 decades ago, from what I understand, right?
Right.
Okay.
I've had my 50th birthday. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Well, I did that a long time ago and have moved on a decade or two. But Chryss, tell us what led up to your decision to put this into a book.
Well, I had always thought I dealt with, I'm doing air quotes, dealt with my brother's suicide, and I was just fine, no problem. And then I had 2 daughters, and they turned, my oldest turned 15, and my youngest was 12 at the time. So the ages my brother and I were when he died. And I remember taking my older daughter to high school, and just I watched her get swallowed up by that row of doors in front of this massive high school. And I just had my first, I guess you would call it, panic attack. I had trouble driving home. I was just struck by this out of nowhere that my daughter wasn't going to come out of that high school, because on some level my brother went into high school. We did it younger then. We were older. Sorry. He was 15 when he went in, and he never came out, is one way of looking at it. And so all of a sudden it struck me that this could happen to me again, that I could lose someone as close to me as possible to this killer of suicide. And I just, all of a sudden I couldn't stop thinking about suicide and what I could do to help kids entering this age group. And then I'm a journalist, and I found the statistic that suicide is the leading cause of death in Colorado for 10 to 24-year-olds. And I was so saddened by that all these decades later, this killer is still taking our young people at a higher rate than car accidents or cancer or anything else. So I'm hoping that writing about it will help some other kids choose a path different than the path my brother chose.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and I'm so sorry for the loss of your brother. You were 12, he was 15. You've been a successful journalist in that time span up to now, and then the almost simple event of watching your daughter go into the school put you back on this path. Was it a path that you, I guess, what was your relation to your brother's death during that interceding time?
Well, it's interesting writing the book. There was this overwhelming message when I was a kid, especially from adults, to just not talk about it, that my parents had been through enough, and so I needed to be good and not upset them. And so I learned right away, the day after he died, to keep my feelings to myself. And in a way, I feel like my brain wasn't developed enough to deal with this grief. And it's something I've learned, that grief is patient, and it waited for me to be able to deal with it. To answer your question, I really didn't deal with it. I went through college once I moved away from the town, Loveland, where Mark died, and people didn't know me as the kid whose brother committed suicide, I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell anybody in college, in my first couple jobs. It's a thing I told a few trusted people, but their reaction was the look on a person's face when you tell them, oh, my brother, when you tell them about your tragedy. A lot of people just don't know what to do with that, which is understandable, but I lost a lot of people if I would tell them about Mark. So I just quit telling people. I just said, I'm an only child, because you'd be surprised how often the question comes up, oh, you have any brothers and sisters? And it's just a getting to know you question. And so I just learned to say I was an only child. You know, sometimes my mom would bring Mark up. He has the same birthday as my dad. So it was always a little August 30th, you know, it's Dad's birthday, but it's also Mark's birthday. And or at Christmas time, there'd be an ornament he made hanging on the tree. Yeah, there was years and years where people didn't know. And I don't know if I'm going on too long about this, but I worked at the Colorado Inn here in Fort Collins for 10 years. And there was a double suicide. 2 teenagers drove their car into the wall up at Horsetooth. And I heard everybody in the newsroom, the community, just saying, why? And so I wrote a column that they're never going to have a satisfactory answer to that question. And as a survivor, I just wanted them to know that, and I was trying to offer condolences of a different kind, you know, that you'll come to make peace with this, hopefully, but you're never going to have an answer that's going to satisfy this hole that's been ripped in your chest, you know. So they ended up running it on the front page, and so it was like a coming out for me in the 90s. And there were people in the newsroom that were actually hurt. They thought they were friends of mine. I mean, they were, but I had never told them about Mark. And so I got some initial reaction, but then when that quieted down, I kept it to myself again till the girls got old enough that I had to deal with it.
I know that one of the things that drew me to your story is you talk about in a way of post-traumatic stress, and how your symptoms or your situation and one of other survivors mirrors that. How can you say a little bit more about that?
I've always been the person that's never sick, you know, I'm tough. If something happens to me, I'm not going to complain, or, you know, my arm's hanging off by a thread, I'm not going to go to the emergency room. I don't want to bother him. I'm just kidding. But I literally got sick. I mean, I've heard about PTSD. My uncle was in Vietnam. He has PTSD. But there's still this sense like that it's not real, that it's not a real thing, you know, that it's, oh, why can't they deal with it, you know? And then it happened to me. And I found myself explaining over and over that this was real. And then to add to that, it's been almost 40 years since Mark died. So they're like, how can you possibly be this traumatized when this happened 40 years ago? And honestly, Joe, it's worse. This past year has been worse than 1981, the year my brother died, because my mind is developed enough to really realize the impact all this had on me. And anyway, I got sick. I lost a lot of weight. I couldn't drink. I can't sleep. You know, I realized I was drinking to numb out. And it didn't work anymore. You know, I just became just so upset. Like once the beast is out of the cage, you can't control it if you have a drink.
Right.
Anyway, and just trying to educate people around me to what that is, you know, because people have met this Chryss Cada and they've known her for decades, and then all of a sudden I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. I can't do this anymore, or I'm not the same person, you know. In a way, I'm going back to the 12-year-old that was so angry and bewildered. So that's difficult for people to understand.
Mm-hmm. Right. And difficult for you to also, I mean, difficult on you. How have you tried to understand this?
Well, I'm a journalist, at heart, and I just research the hell out of all of this, and I even felt weak I finally went to my boss and said, hey, this is a thing that's going on, but I was afraid to because I thought they're going to not renew my contract at CSU to teach. They're going to think there's some crazy mental breakdown person in front of all these kids, students. I actually didn't tell them until the semester was over because I want to be in front of these kids, but it's hard to hide what's going on when there's 18 faces looking at you, waiting for you to say something, and you've just been thinking about the time your brother pulled you out of the swimming pool or whatever. Like I'm still living in the 80s in a way, or the 70s actually. And that's a poignant question because taking it easy on myself has been the hardest thing. Because I was the first person that didn't believe it. It was like, Chryss, you're a mom. You have to take care of your kids. Like, you need to get your shit together personally so that you can play these other roles that you're supposed to play now. You're not
12. Yeah. And one of the things that in our conversations before this was that kind of the dual role of this is my experience, this is what I've lived, but also because you're a journalist, having to dig deeper in almost an objective, tremendously subjective way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I found myself in some of these reports, like the Dialogue of Clinical Neuroscience is one place I was reading, and I thought, I have to infuse this with my own experience to make it relatable. I mean, nobody wants to read through, nothing personal to researchers, but, you've dealt with some. You have to glean out of there, what does this really mean? How can I keep my teenager safe? That's one thing. A lot of people, when they hear I'm writing this book, they want to know how they can keep their teenager safe. And that's, where I can put the research for them. But some of the most disturbing things are that, for me, a lot of people make the decision in a hurry, in less than an hour from when they decide to when they carry it out. I think there's a little bit of a safety feeling that people have that there's going to be warning signs. And so they always ask me, well, what were the warning signs? Did you see the warning signs? Which, by the way, don't ever ask a survivor that because it makes them think they could have done something that puts the onus on them. In a way, I'm like, I was 12, first of all. You wouldn't expect a 12-year-old to think, oh, I bet my brother's going to kill himself. You think he's going to feed the rabbits or drink beer or whatever, but not that. I'm sorry, I went on a tangent.
Yeah.
Maybe you can lead me back.
But it's that combination of the objective and the personal.
Yeah.
And just how how that balance. And one of the things that I was really interested with what you were saying right there was that you'd be reading a research journal, a research article, but then have this deep feeling, well, what about this?
Yeah, right.
This experience in here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and my editor actually told me a couple times to not rely, don't regurgitate research. Tell your readers how this looked for you and your family. What happened with you and your family, not just, this many percentage of suicide survivors have a higher risk or whatever. So, I could talk about, I felt that way after my brother died, because you see it as an option all of a sudden. I mean, that wasn't in my world. I didn't know anybody who had died anyway. And my grandparents were still alive. So it was like, all of a sudden that's a reality. So I wrote about that instead of just the statistic that survivors are this percentage more likely to die by suicide or to attempt. I said, I felt that way because of, my big brother did it.
Uh-huh. Another thing that I was in earlier conversation was the path that you're with this, you share with your parents.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really struck by how your family, this family, is sharing this path, but is also, the path is so different for each of you.
Yeah.
Tell me, if it's okay, to relate how that works for you, or how that happens.
Well, it's interesting because ABC News made a documentary about my brother's death that aired on national television about 7 months after he died. And I all of a sudden started thinking, after all these years, hey, I remembered it. Some things you just block so far back. Anyway, I said, I bet Mom and Dad have a copy. But I went up to their house and I looked for it when they weren't there. Because there's kind of this unspoken truth we have that we don't bring Mark up. Because when he's been buried that deeply, it's like it's my dad's choice, for example, to do that. So I don't want to break his choice, his way of coping, or my mom's, which is, you don't have enough time to talk about my mom and I. But anyway, so I did all of this on my own. I didn't want to upset them. But at some point, I started asking my dad. My dad and I go skiing together a fair amount. It's a long ride up there, especially with traffic. And so I brought it up a few times. I said, hey, did you ever find a copy of that documentary? And so he talked to me about Mark because he wanted to help me. But other than that, I mean, it's just been very different. My mom, right away when Mark died, she started a teen center in Loveland. She started peer-to-peer counseling in the high school. She was looking for all the things she could do to make a difference. She talked a lot about how kids that are in great need get attention, but kids like Mark, who on the surface was fine, might not be so easy to see the burden that's haunting him, or however you want to paraphrase it. She got really active that way, and it's just been tough because I don't feel like I can go to my parents for support. I was told early on that I shouldn't upset my parents because they'd already been through enough with what happened to Mark. I say happened to Mark, but anyway, I was left alone to deal with it. And that's a big part of my book too, because something like 87% of kids in this country live with a sibling, which is more than live with a father. For every teen suicide, I almost called my book Top of the Stairs, because for every teen suicide, there's likely 8 out of 10 times that there's a little kid sitting at the top of the stairs, kind of in the shadows, listening to what's going on in the living room where the adults are having all these conversations. And it used to be the thought, oh, we're going to protect the kids by not talking about what happened. And what it does is it just leaves the child there alone to try to figure it out. And when you're 12 or whatever age you are, it's too much to make sense of without an adult. So that's another really big part of my book, is the siblings and these children that are left behind by suicide, that because it can really change the way your brain forms. Speaking
Mhm.
of PTSD, a lot of trauma survivors like myself, I have a 4 alarm fire bell going off in my head all the time, So like every time my phone rings, I think something's wrong. Like some people are, oh, the phone, somebody's calling me. I'm always like, oh no, what happened?
Mhm.
So
Right.
that's a really long answer to your question, I
That's okay. That's
think.
okay. Unlike your editor, I don't have a word count.
Nice. I love it.
Hmm. Well, I guess for to talk about a word count, to talk about the process of writing a book, I think it's 15 months in in the making.
It turned into 19,
Oh, okay. So
but
19
I want
months.
credit for all of those months. Um, Well, yeah, I mentioned earlier, I'm a journalist, so I'm used to a really quick turnaround. I mean, even hours, usually at the newspaper. I worked at a daily newspaper for more than a decade, so I'm used to like, here's your assignment, and then by the time you go home, it's off your hands, right? And this book, I mean, it lives with me. It's Mark and I have been hanging out for 19, 20 months now, and in a way, that's been awesome. And when I finished the book, I had this secondary kind of loss because I was used to, I don't know if I mentioned, but I kept a diary every day since I was 10. And so part of this process was going through those diaries. And it's like, Mark and I did this, Mark and I did that, because we were inseparable. We grew up in the foothills 20 minutes from town. So it's not like we had play dates or camps. You hang out with your siblings. That's
Uh-huh.
go play with your sister. It wasn't like, and we had no phones, God forbid. So anyway, we spent a lot of time together. And the good part of this process was just reliving all those memories and what he meant to me and how we related to each other. And so when I was done with that, I was really sad again. And sad is such a small word. I talk about that, but I was just empty again, hollowed out again, when I finished the book.
Mm-hmm.
Another loss. I'm like, oh, I'm not going to be hanging out with Mark anymore. So
Uh-huh.
we hang out still.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And I've gotten used to, like, I'm not a spiritual person really, but I've come to, I mean, I hear my brother's voice in my head a lot now. And sometimes I talk out loud to him, and, I'm, I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Is it the writing, getting it down onto paper or screen,
Yeah.
been a catharsis? Has it what?
Yeah, and you'd hope that. Like a lot of my friends were, but it's cathartic, right? Because they just felt so badly for what I was going through. And, a lot of my friends told me, well, don't do this. It's going to be horrible. Why in the world? And I said, I can't not do it. It's like in my head all the time. It keeps me up. Mark's like, get up, get to work. But it is because on a deeper level, I'm more okay than I have been in a really long time, since probably before Mark died. I mean, my emotions are a lot closer to the surface all the time now, but the deep down stuff is getting better. I can feel it. I don't necessarily, this is going to sound overly dramatic, but before I started writing this book, and part of why I started writing it is I just have this deep-seated belief my daughters aren't going to survive adolescence. I just know that on some level. I'm like, well, a lot of them kids die. That's just what I think. And I'm starting to let some light in on the thought that maybe my children will survive adolescence, which
Mm-hmm.
is just revolutionary to me. So, and probably to them, I'm always like, be careful, be careful. Like, God forbid. One time my daughter, she'd hate me telling this story, but she told me, because I'm so worried about their mental state too. It's not just like wear your bike helmet. For me, it's like what's going on under the bike helmet, right? That worries me. And one day she said, "Mom, I'm not suicidal. I'm just annoyed." I was like, okay, valid point. I mean, I'm thankful that I can have those kind of conversations with my daughters and their friends and my college students. They all know because these things are happening to them and they have these feelings, but there's this kind of thing in our society that talking about them makes them real. And so they're afraid to mention that they've been feeling that way. And anyway, so that makes me feel better that I'm helping. I feel like I'm helping. So that's better. And I feel better that Mark's getting some airtime, you know. So.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity from a writer, as a journalist, the story you tell is factual. Have you ever written fiction?
I haven't.
No.
I haven't. And it's interesting because I took creative writing in college, and one of them was they said write a story about somebody saving your life. And even to that assignment, I wrote about the time my brother pulled me out of the pool when I was drowning. And the editor, my teacher, said, well, this is just, you need to make it more believable. You know, this is all this drama. I mean, whose 11-year-old brother would pull their 8-year-old sister out of the pool? Or, you know, I mean, hopefully a lot of kids. But he was like, you know, this character isn't believable. And I said, well, he is believable because that's the true story, you know. And this is in a fiction class. Even in a fiction class, I was like, well, I already have a good story about that. I don't have to make one up. So, I've never, even when my kids were like, tell me a bedtime story, I'd talk about camping with my dad or something. I just couldn't. I would think
it's just not in you.
Yeah, I guess not. And I just really, it was important to me that this book is factual, even though there's so many emotions. I feel like having my diaries, because that's what you call them when you're 11. You don't call it a journal. You call it a diary. But having those thoughts written down was so, I don't think I could have written the book otherwise, because that journalist that is me is like, well, you don't know that for sure, you know, but having it written down, I'm like, I know for sure we had raspberry popsicles and not strawberry. Sometimes my editor was like, that doesn't really matter, but I'm like, I don't know, I just don't want, I feel like if any of the book wasn't 100% true, that it would draw into question the other parts of it. So that wasn't your question, but I was just a real stickler that everything be accurate to the word.
Yeah.
Who knows? I might write fiction someday, but.
Yeah. Well, just curious on that.
Yeah.
And when you were saying about the need for it to be true, if a part of it wasn't, then maybe the whole thing unravels in some sort of way.
Well, can I tell you a quick funny story?
Sure.
Believe it or not, there are funny stories in my book. But I used to write Dear Dairy instead of diary. And what I think is so funny is I'm a horrible speller. I still am. Horrible speller. And the front of my diary says, my diary. So the correct spelling is on the cover. Every day for a year, I opened that book and wrote Dear Dairy. And so my editor and I had this long conversation. She's like, would it be distracting that you say Dear Dairy? And I'm like, but you have to leave it because that's the way I wrote it, you know? And part of me, I include things in there that show I was a 10-year-old, 11, 12-year-old girl, 13, and when this happened, and it's also a book about the end of childhood, because I've seen with my own daughters, that usually childhood kind of slips away from you here and there as you paint your fingernails, get a phone, whatever. Not saying you painted your fingernails, but you know what I mean.
I'm going to go with it.
Yeah, not that anything's wrong with that. But with me, I knew exactly when my childhood ended, and you can see it in my diary, because I go from slumber parties and Polly Beckett is being mean because she's hanging out with Jackie or whatever, to I'm going to drink beer under the bridge by Skate Castle because that's what Mark used to do, and, the book's a lot of things. Maybe that's why it's so long.
What do you hope people get from this book?
Well, I hope they find someone like themselves on a lot of different levels. I've talked to you before about how alone suicide survivors feel, partially because of the shame, but I've never had a community of peers that have been through this. I've never met anyone who lost their older brother when they were a child, despite it being 40 years. And I hope my book finds them, and I hope they see themselves, and I selfishly would love to meet them because I've never, when you're a suicide survivor like this, it's not something my husband can relate to, or my friends, or, it's just, even on some level, as we talked about my family, because they were parents and they were adults and it was different for them. So I hope my book finds people that have been through this. And we were also talking earlier, there's this feeling that on some level that suicide survivors are fragile, or attempters even are fragile, and we have to, and on some level we are, but we're also incredibly tough. I mean, what survivors have been through is, just unparalleled. Not that it's a competition, but I talk about that. I mean, if someone's lived through suicide, you're badass, and I would just like to congratulate you on that. And, maybe you can find that in my book. And also, I hope my book reaches parents that are worried about their adolescents, which is pretty much every parent of an adolescent, I believe, because it's scary, when you see that statistic that suicide is the leading cause of death, 10 to 24-year-olds in Colorado. I mean, we can help them learn how to drive and wear their bike helmet and talk to them about drugs and all of that stuff. But we need to talk to them about this too. And we need for them to know that they can, if they start to have these horrible feelings, we're their ally. We understand. It's not like they're doing anything wrong. It's part of the adolescence to have this darkness whisper in your ear. So I originally thought it was for teenagers, but my editor's like, no, this isn't for teenagers. But maybe some older and teenagers, young adults will find value in it as well. Mm-hmm. And on another level, it's for anybody who cares about kids, which I think hopefully covers most of the population, because you don't have to be a parent to be that person. There's also a statistic that I end the book with, is that a young person's 3.5 times less likely to commit suicide if they have a trusted adult they can speak to. So that's the number one, by far, protective factor. And so any of us can do that. Anybody can see somebody that is maybe struggling. I mean, even if it's the kid that serves your coffee at Starbucks every morning, you can still take time to see how they're doing. And that's kind of my soapbox I get up on. But I just really hope, people feel hopeless when they hear that statistic about suicide, and when they hear, here in Fort Collins, we had 3 11-year-olds commit suicide within a 2-month period. And you just get this feeling like, oh my God, there's nothing we can do. An 11-year-old, and it's just, but you can, you can. And so I hope that my book does that,
Mm-hmm. That caring adult realizes that they can make a difference.
Yeah, and And with teenagers, you might not even know they're listening to you. Their eyes are rolled so far back in their head. They might fall over backwards. But I still, my daughter's friends, I'm like, "You're awesome, by the way," or just random thoughts like that. Just you never know what a big impact you could be having on somebody. So, and I'm not like Pollyanna, go around blowing sunshine everywhere, usually in my life, but in this case, I've really found. I mean, what can it hurt to reach out to a teenager? I mean, there's no downside. So.
So you're going to be doing book signings at some point.
Yes.
You'll have done the reading, you read some things from your book that are going to resonate with different people. They're going to line up. They're going to, one at a time, come to you. They want your signature, but they also want more than that.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to reach folks and then have a moment with them. How is that going to be?
Yeah, I've thought about that. I have had I've had essays in a couple of books, and I've had book signings before, but it wasn't on this topic. It was like relationships between mothers and daughters, which is also a big topic. But, you can just have a little moment. It doesn't, without going into it. But if someone's in your line and it's like, on the cover page of my manuscript, it says 15 taken by suicide by Chryss Cada, Mark's sister. And that's how I want it to be on the book. And I imagine when someone's in front of me, did you lose somebody? Who did you lose? And I do want to know, but it's not a short conversation, and I feel like I do want to have an authentic conversation with them. And I mentioned earlier, I hope to reach out to the suicide prevention centers or maybe some sort of grief counselor in the town that I'm visiting so that I have someone there with me, or that people can form a small group, given that we're allowed to meet by that point in our life. We'll sit 6 feet apart, but just so that they can continue that conversation, because when people read my book, my editor is the only person that's read it start to finish. And she said it not haunted her, but she said she'd go to sleep thinking about Mark and I. She'd wake up thinking about Mark and I. It's a very personal, I'm letting people in everywhere. I don't hide anything. And so they're going to feel like they have a relationship with me because of the way this book is written. And I want to honor that. And I actually have, not to be egotistical, but I have worried that I will be able to give readers, that kind of moment or a piece of my time, because I want to, but I do feel like this is a untapped vein, or I don't know how to put it, but there's not a book out there like this. I know I've looked for it. I would have loved to find it, I would have been so happy to find it, but hopefully this will do that for other people. They're out there.
Yeah.
Be out there. So, thanks for your confidence, by the way.
Quite. Yeah, well, and it's so many ways. It was the sincerity of your voice in reading, what you were signing off from this column. And it was the sincerity, the honesty there that made me want to reach out and follow up with you.
Well, I'm glad you did it.
Yeah. So it has winding down now. The one thing I'd love to bring you back after some of that experience, and and look at it and you know, touch on what 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 that's been like for you. We've come to believe that, listening to those with the lived expertise, that there's a lot there. So one, I'll take this moment to say we'll get back together
Okay,
um,
good.
after a while, and then is there one last thing you'd like to share with us?
Well, I just have this feeling. Anybody who's been in therapy, they're 50-minute sessions, right? And usually you watch the clock and you're like, okay, I only have 5 minutes. I better make this good. We better get down to it right now. And yes, I've been in a fair amount of therapy in my life, and so it's good to know that this isn't the end of the conversation. And I want to put it out there. I am just 100% open to talking to people, and I want them to know that I find myself apologizing before I tell my brother's story a lot because it feels like a burden that you put on people. But there are people out there that can take some of that burden and share it with you and make it lighter. So I'm happy to be one of those people. Hopefully we can all find each other so that it's not just something you have to carry by yourself. So, yeah, Chryss.com.
That's right. And we will have a link to your website. And I should point out right away that it's a non-traditional Chryss, and it's spelled Chryss.
Yes.
So,
Me. Chryss Cada, Mark's sister. So, all right.
And so much more.
Yes.
Very much more. And we're really looking forward to the book coming out.
I'll keep you posted.
I've been lucky enough to read a couple advanced chapters, and I think you've got a great style and a great voice. So, Chryss, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Talk to you again.
Yeah. So that's going to be it today, folks, for this week's short takes on suicide prevention. And we'll keep everybody posted on the progress of the book. But, what we're trying to do here is give voice and, show that there's a lot out there and a lot that we can do for one another. Thanks for being here, and stay.